Christian faith never ever exists in a spiritual or cultural vacuum. It always exists within societies and cultures, some of which may be more amenable to the faith, some less. I have observed over the years that Christians in different countries adopt very different habits and practices as part of the faith that actually have their roots in the cultures around them, but which they have freely adopted as part of their practice of the faith. I'll share just two examples. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas. Both examples are from the Christian churches in Pakistan. As you know, Pakistan is now a majority Muslim country. But before partition in 1947, the region of Pakistan with which I am familiar, the Punjab region, included both Muslims and Hindus. As a result, many of the traditional practices of those religions have been adopted into Christian practice. One of those practices is for women to cover their heads during prayers, a practice that also has some Christian history behind it, but which is simply a part of that country's culture. The second traditional practice is to refrain from eating pork. Again, you may know that Muslims, along with most Jews, do not eat pork in any form. And although there is no restriction against Christians consuming pork, you won't find Christians in Pakistan frying bacon in the morning. It just isn't done. These are just some of the things that have become part of Christian practice in Pakistan, even though they are not required of Christians generally. Is this a problem? Certainly not. For as I say, the Christian church always finds itself embedded within cultures and within the cultural milieu of particular places and times. The way people think and speak generally in a culture has a way of seeping into the church. It's just unavoidable. Having said that, there are times when the church has to make a decision about whether to adopt the thoughts, mores, and practices of the cultures around it. Paul frequently had to advise his churches how to differentiate themselves from some of the cultural norms that he believed were antithetical to Christian faith and practice. The letter to the Colossians is a tour de force of this kind of lesson. Let me begin where I left off yesterday, starting with the last couple of verses that we read yesterday. As you therefore have received Christ Jesus the Lord, continue to live your lives in him, rooted and built up in him and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the universe, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have come to fullness in him who is the head of every ruler and authority. In him you also were circumcised with a spiritual circumcision by putting off the body of the flesh in the circumcision of Christ. When you were buried with him in baptism, you were also raised with him through faith in the power of God, who raised him from the dead. And when you were dead in trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive together with him when he forgave us all our trespasses, erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands. He set this aside, nailing it on the cross. He disarms the rulers and authorities and made a public example, triumphing over them. Yesterday, I mentioned the idea of being rooted, but I focused on the roots, leaves, and flowers of the plant. Today, it's the soil in which we are rooted that comes into play. The city of Colossae was a pretty cosmopolitan city with people from a whole variety of religious and philosophical backgrounds. Apparently, the generally accepted beliefs of that time and that place were not all that amenable to Christian faith. It's a little hard to pin them down this far removed from them, but what we know is this. People frequently heard new religious ideas and incorporated them into a larger framework of belief. The general framework of belief in Colossae was something like our current system of astrology, but more well-developed. They believed that people's destinies were controlled by what Paul calls the elemental spirits of the universe, by which he likely meant the stars and planets and the gods that they represented. People believed that the material world as we know it was totally separate from God, who is spirit. And the only way for human beings to be in communion with the great God of heaven was through a whole series of lesser gods, spirits, and angels, who could mediate between the material world in which we live and the spiritual world of God. Many of these people could easily incorporate Jesus into this scheme, but only as one of a number of these lesser intermediaries above humans, but lesser than God. I think by my description you can see part of the problem right away. There are several reasons which I'll explain as we read through Colossians, but the primary reason why Paul believed that the church could not simply adopt the common beliefs of that culture was that for him, and for us, Jesus Christ isn't just one of a number of intermediaries, he is the intermediary, reconciling us to God. And he's not a lesser being, he is God. Now, Christianity has been at its most brilliant when it has learned how to adopt and to adapt practices and even beliefs from the cultures in which it has been found. But there are limits to that. And what Paul does in Colossians is help us define the boundaries of that faith. And as long as we are firmly rooted within that faith, we are able to live faithfully in whatever culture we may find ourselves. And now may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.